She couldn't remember the last time she cried only once a day. The tears came in waves, without warning, without permission. Sometimes in the shower, sometimes in the car, sometimes late at night when the world finally went quiet and there was nothing left to distract her from what she was feeling. Crying wasn't dramatic anymore, it was automatic. People around her thought she was just tired, stressed, sensitive. But what they didn't see was how deeply overwhelmed she felt inside. It wasn't one problem. It was the accumulation of everything she had been holding together for far too long. Every disappointment she never spoke about. Every fear she minimized. Every hope she slowly stopped expecting. She cried because she felt stuck in a reality that no longer made sense to her. A life that looked functional from the outside, but felt unbearable on the inside. She kept asking herself how she ended up here, doing everything she could, trying to stay strong, yet feeling like she was constantly on the edge of breaking. The hardest part wasn't the sadness itself. It was the feeling of powerlessness. The sense that no matter how much effort she made, nothing truly shifted. That her tears were the only honest response her body had left. Crying became the place where everything she couldn't say out loud finally escaped. There were moments when she tried to stop herself. She told herself to be grateful, to calm down, to think positively. But the more she tried to suppress it, the heavier everything became. The tears weren't weakness, they were pressure releasing. A sign that something inside her was no longer willing to pretend. Late one night, sitting alone with her face buried in her hands, she had a thought that scared her more than the crying itself. What if this is just my life now? What if this constant ache, this quiet despair, is as good as it gets? She didn't know it yet, but that moment, that question, was the beginning of everything changing. The crying wasn't about one specific event. It was about living in a constant state of emotional tension, where nothing ever felt resolved. Every day demanded strength she no longer had, and every night reminded her that pretending was exhausting. She wasn't falling apart all at once, she was wearing down slowly. She carried the weight of expectations that weren't even hers anymore. Expectations to stay composed. To keep going. To not complain. She had learned to function through discomfort so well that no one noticed how much it cost her. On the outside, she was capable. On the inside, she was empty. What hurt most was the feeling that she had lost connection with herself. She no longer recognized the person she was becoming. Joy felt distant. Motivation felt forced. Even rest didn't restore her. Crying was the only moment she felt honest, the only time she allowed herself to stop performing. She kept replaying moments in her mind, wondering where things had gone wrong. Was it a decision she made? A chance she didn't take? Or was this just the reality she was meant to live in? The uncertainty fed the sadness, and the sadness fed the exhaustion. She noticed how easily she blamed herself. If things weren't changing, it must be because she wasn't doing enough. Thinking enough. Believing enough. That internal pressure became unbearable. Her mind demanded answers her heart couldn't give. There were days when she woke up already feeling heavy, as if the night hadn't ended at all. The tears came before she could stop them, catching her by surprise in moments that were supposed to be normal. Buying groceries. Answering a simple message. Standing in line. The smallest things triggered everything she had been holding back. She didn't realize yet that her crying wasn't a sign that she was weak or broken. It was a signal. Something inside her was asking for change, not through effort, but through a different way of seeing her reality. At some point, she began to notice something unsettling. The world around her wasn't changing, but neither was the way she was meeting it. Every day felt like a repetition of the same emotional pattern, regardless of what actually happened. The circumstances varied, but the feeling remained. Heavy. Tight. overwhelming. She realized that even on days when nothing particularly bad occurred, the sadness was already waiting. It lived beneath the surface, ready to rise at the smallest trigger. That's when it became clear that the crying wasn't only a reaction to events, it was a state she had been living in. This awareness didn't bring relief at first. It brought fear. If the problem wasn't just external, then fixing things wouldn't be as simple as changing a job, a routine, or a relationship. It meant something deeper needed attention. Something she had been avoiding because she didn't know where to begin. She started noticing her inner dialogue more closely. How quickly her thoughts moved toward hopeless conclusions. How often she assumed the worst before anything had a chance to unfold. It was subtle, constant, and exhausting. No wonder her body kept releasing it through tears. She had been living in survival mode for so long that she didn't know how to exist any other way. Her nervous system was always braced, always anticipating disappointment. Even rest carried tension. Even silence felt loud. What frightened her most was realizing how normal this had become. She had adapted to emotional pain so gradually that she didn't question it anymore. Crying wasn't alarming, it was familiar. And familiarity had disguised itself as inevitability. For the first time, she wondered if her tears were trying to tell her something important. Not that something was wrong with her, but that something in the way she was living no longer aligned with who she was meant to be. She didn't have answers yet. But she had awareness. And awareness, quietly, was beginning to open a door she didn't know existed. That awareness didn't feel gentle. It unsettled her in a way she couldn't ignore. Once she saw the pattern, she couldn't unsee it. The crying was no longer just something that happened to her, it was something connected to how she was living inside her own thoughts. And that realization brought an uncomfortable sense of responsibility. She began to notice how often she anticipated pain before it arrived. How her mind rehearsed loss, rejection, and disappointment as if preparing her for impact. She believed she was protecting herself, but all she was really doing was keeping her body in a constant state of tension. The tears were the overflow of a system that never felt safe enough to relax. This understanding didn't immediately stop the crying. In fact, at first, it made it more intense. Because now, every tear carried meaning. Every wave of emotion felt like a message she hadn't learned how to translate yet. She wasn't just sad, she was listening for the first time. There were moments when she wished she could go back to not knowing. Ignorance had felt easier. But something inside her refused to return to unconscious survival. Once the truth surfaced, it demanded space. It demanded attention. And it demanded honesty. She found herself questioning beliefs she had never challenged before. The belief that life was supposed to be endured. That struggle was normal. That happiness was something temporary, reserved for other people or other phases. These ideas had shaped her reality quietly, consistently, and without her consent. The discomfort grew because she sensed that continuing the same way was no longer an option. Even if change felt terrifying, staying where she was felt unbearable. That tension, between fear and necessity, became impossible to ignore. For the first time, her tears didn't feel like weakness. They felt like resistance breaking. Something inside her was loosening its grip on a reality that no longer fit. And though she didn't know what came next, she knew this: she could not keep living the same way. There came a day when the crying stopped her completely. Not because it ended, but because it arrived with such force that she couldn't move through it like she usually did. She sat down, right where she was, and let it happen without trying to control it. For the first time, she didn't rush to distract herself or explain it away. In that stillness, she felt how tired she truly was. Not physically, but emotionally. Tired of carrying the same weight every day. Tired of telling herself she just needed to be stronger. Tired of surviving a life that no longer felt like hers. The tears kept coming, but beneath them, something else surfaced: exhaustion with the old way of being. She realized she had been waiting for circumstances to change so she could feel different. Waiting for relief to arrive from the outside. Waiting for something to save her from herself. And that waiting had kept her frozen, believing that peace was always one step away but never available now. That realization hurt more than the sadness. Because it meant that as long as she stayed in that position, waiting, hoping, enduring, nothing would truly shift. Not because life was cruel, but because she was participating in it from a place of resignation. She didn't know what needed to change yet. She only knew that something had to. The crying had become a message she could no longer ignore. A boundary her body was drawing where her mind had refused to. In that moment, she wasn't looking for answers. She wasn't trying to manifest anything. She simply acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. Continuing like this was not an option anymore. And that acknowledgement, quiet, heavy, and undeniable, marked the end of one chapter, even though she had no idea what the next one would look like. What happened next wasn't dramatic, and that was exactly why it reached her. It didn't arrive as a solution or a revelation, but as something small that landed differently because she was finally receptive. After days of emotional exhaustion, she found herself in a rare moment of stillness, not because she felt better, but because she had no energy left to resist what she was feeling. In that quiet space, her mind slowed just enough for a thought to surface, not a comforting one, but an honest one. She realized how often she replayed the same inner story every day, even when nothing new had happened. The story that said things were hard, that life was unfair, that she was always behind, always struggling, always carrying more than she could handle. It had become the lens through which she saw everything. She noticed how familiar that narrative felt, how automatic it was. It had been running for so long that she didn't remember choosing it. And yet, it shaped her emotional reality more consistently than any external circumstance. The crying wasn't random. It was the emotional response to living inside that story without questioning it. This realization didn't bring immediate relief. In fact, it felt unsettling. If her inner narrative had such power over her emotional state, then continuing to repeat it meant continuing the same pain. But if she questioned it, she didn't know what would replace it. Letting go felt risky, almost irresponsible, as if she might lose control of the only reality she knew. She sat with that discomfort longer than she ever had before. Instead of trying to fix it or push it away, she allowed herself to observe it. That alone changed something. For the first time, she wasn't drowning in her emotions, she was witnessing them. And that subtle shift created a crack in the pattern she had been living in. It wasn't a breakthrough yet. It was more like a pause in the noise. But in that pause, she sensed that the way she had been living inside her thoughts was not the only option available to her. And that awareness, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of a different relationship with her own mind. As she stayed with that awareness, she began to see how deeply ingrained those thoughts really were. They weren't fleeting reactions to bad days or difficult moments. They were beliefs she had been carrying for years, quietly shaping how she interpreted everything that happened to her. The crying, the exhaustion, the sense of being trapped, all of it made more sense when she recognized how consistently she had been telling herself the same internal story. She noticed how those beliefs showed up in the smallest situations. A delay became proof that things never worked out for her. A minor setback felt like confirmation that she was always struggling. Even neutral moments were quickly colored by expectations of disappointment. It wasn't life attacking her, it was her mind translating reality through a lens of inevitability. This realization was uncomfortable because it removed the illusion that her suffering was entirely out of her control. It suggested that, without realizing it, she had been participating in the same emotional cycle day after day. Not because she wanted to suffer, but because she had learned to survive by expecting the worst. That expectation had once protected her from surprise, but now it was draining her. She felt a mix of grief and relief. Grief for how long she had lived inside a belief system that kept her emotionally constricted. Relief because, if these beliefs were learned, they were not fixed. They could be questioned. And questioning them didn't mean denying her pain, it meant understanding it. For the first time, she considered that her tears were not signs of weakness, but signals pointing towards something that needed to change at a foundational level. The sadness wasn't random. It was the emotional response to a reality built on assumptions she had never examined. She didn't know yet how to change those beliefs. She didn't even know what she would replace them with. But simply recognizing that they existed, that they were not facts, but patterns, shifted something inside her. It created distance between who she was and what she had been believing. And in that distance, something new began to form. A quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, her reality didn't have to be lived from the same emotional ground forever. As this understanding settled in, she became painfully aware of how exhausting it had been to live in a constant state of emotional anticipation. Her body had been bracing itself every single day, preparing for disappointment before anything even happened. That vigilance had felt normal for so long that she never questioned it, but now she could feel how much it had drained her over time. She realized that her tears were not reactions to the present moment. They were releases of accumulated tension. Years of expecting things to go wrong. Years of carrying the belief that stability, joy, or ease were temporary at best. Her nervous system had been stuck in survival mode, and crying had become the only outlet it had left. This awareness made her see her body differently. It wasn't betraying her with emotions she couldn't control. It was trying to protect her from a reality it perceived as unsafe. The constant sadness wasn't weakness, it was a signal that something inside her could no longer sustain the way she was living. She noticed how often she rushed through her days without truly being present. Her mind was always ahead, scanning for what might go wrong next. Even moments that should have felt neutral or calm were lived with tension. There was no space to relax because she didn't believe relaxation was safe. For the first time, she allowed herself to slow down without judgment. Not to fix anything, not to feel better immediately, but simply to listen. And what she heard was clear: continuing to live from fear and anticipation was costing her more than she could afford emotionally. This realization didn't come with panic. It came with a quiet seriousness. A knowing that something fundamental had to change, not in her circumstances first, but in the internal state she was carrying into every moment of her life. She didn't yet know how to shift that state. But she knew she could no longer ignore what her body and emotions had been telling her all along. As she sat with everything she had begun to see, a quiet but unfamiliar question surfaced in her mind. What if the way she had been living emotionally wasn't the only option available to her? The thought didn't come with certainty or optimism. It came cautiously, almost hesitantly, as if her mind was testing whether it was safe to consider something different. She noticed how quickly she tried to dismiss that idea. Years of disappointment had trained her not to expect relief. Hoping felt risky. Imagining a different internal state felt naive. And yet, despite that resistance, the question lingered. It stayed with her longer than she expected, gently challenging the assumption that this constant heaviness was inevitable. She began to observe moments when the intensity softened, even briefly. Small pauses where the sadness loosened its grip. Moments when her breathing felt a little deeper, her chest a little lighter. They didn't last long, but they were enough to show her that another internal experience was possible, even if she didn't know how to access it consistently yet. This realization stirred something fragile but important inside her. She wasn't suddenly hopeful, but she was curious. And curiosity felt different from despair. It didn't demand answers or guarantees. It simply asked whether things could feel different without requiring her to pretend they already were. She became aware of how often she shut herself down the moment a new thought appeared. How quickly she told herself not to get her hopes up, not to expect change, not to believe in something she couldn't see yet. Those reflexes had once protected her from disappointment, but now they were preventing her from exploring another way of being. For the first time, she allowed herself to sit in the uncertainty without rushing to close it. She didn't need to decide anything. She didn't need to change overnight. She only needed to acknowledge that the emotional state she had been living in was not the only one available to her. And that acknowledgement, small as it seemed, shifted the internal ground beneath her. It didn't stop the tears. It didn't erase the pain. But it introduced a new possibility, one that quietly suggested her reality might not be fixed after all. That curiosity didn't push her toward action right away. It simply stayed present, quietly redirecting her attention. She found herself noticing things she would have ignored before, words, ideas, fragments of conversations that seemed to echo the question forming inside her. Not answers, but invitations. Subtle reminders that another way of relating to her reality might exist. She didn't go searching for change. In fact, she was too emotionally tired to chase anything new. But in that exhaustion, her defenses were lower, and she became more receptive. She stopped filtering everything through skepticism and self-protection. For the first time in a long while, she let information reach her without immediately rejecting it. It was during one of these ordinary moments that something landed differently. Not as a promise, not as a solution, but as a perspective she hadn't considered before. The idea wasn't about fixing her life or forcing happiness. It was about understanding how her inner state might be shaping her experience more than she realized. What struck her wasn't excitement, but recognition. A quiet sense that this perspective explained something she had been living without words for years. It didn't invalidate her pain. It contextualized it. It suggested that her emotional reality wasn't random, it was responsive. She didn't fully understand it yet. Parts of her resisted the implication that her inner world mattered this much. But another part of her felt relief. If her internal state had been contributing to her suffering, then perhaps it could also contribute to something different. She didn't commit to anything. She didn't decide to change her life. She simply allowed the idea to exist without dismissing it. And that allowance felt significant. It felt like standing at the edge of something new without needing to step into it yet. In that moment, she didn't stop crying. But the tears felt different. Less hopeless. Less final. As if they were no longer marking the end of something, but the slow beginning of a shift she hadn't yet learned how to name. As that perspective lingered, she began to sit with it more deliberately. Not to analyze it or turn it into a theory, but to feel how it resonated inside her. The idea that her internal state might not be permanent unsettled her in a way that was both uncomfortable and quietly relieving. It challenged something she had accepted as fixed for a very long time. She noticed how her mind immediately tried to negotiate with the idea. If her emotional state could change, then why hadn't it already? What was she missing? What was she doing wrong? Those questions surfaced automatically, shaped by years of self-blame. But this time, she didn't let them take over completely. Instead, she stayed with the possibility itself. The simple notion that sadness wasn't her identity, that crying wasn't her destiny. That what she was experiencing could be a response rather than a sentence. That distinction mattered more than she expected. She realized how often she had treated her emotions as proof of reality rather than as feedback. If she felt hopeless, life must be hopeless. If she felt stuck, nothing could change. Those conclusions had felt logical, even responsible. But now, she could see how they had quietly limited her perception of what was possible. This awareness didn't erase her pain, but it softened its grip. She no longer felt completely defined by it. The sadness was still there, but it wasn't absolute. It was one layer of her experience, not the whole of it. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to live without constant emotional weight. Not in detail, not as a fantasy, but as a state of being that could exist. That imagination didn't make her happy, it made her curious. And curiosity gave her just enough space to breathe. She sensed that if her internal state had been shaped over time, it could also be reshaped. Slowly. Gently. Without force. That realization didn't demand action yet. It simply asked for openness. And in that openness, something within her relaxed slightly. The crying no longer felt like the only possible expression of her inner world. It felt like a phase, intense, real, but not permanent. With that openness growing, she began to relate to her thoughts in a different way. Instead of immediately believing them, she started noticing them. This shift was subtle, but it changed everything. Thoughts that once felt like absolute truths now appeared as mental patterns, familiar, repetitive, and emotionally charged, but no longer unquestionable. She became aware of how quickly her mind moved toward conclusions. A difficult moment would arise, and almost instantly, a story followed. The story explained why things were hard, why they wouldn't improve, why she should brace herself for disappointment. Before, she had merged with that story without realizing it. Now, she could see it forming. This awareness didn't silence her thoughts, and it didn't stop the emotional reactions immediately. But it created space between what she felt and what she believed. That space gave her room to breathe, to pause, to choose not to collapse into the same narrative every time something felt uncomfortable. She noticed how powerful that pause was. Even a few seconds of not reacting changed how her body responded. The tension in her chest didn't escalate as quickly. The tears didn't arrive as forcefully. She was still emotional, still sensitive, but no longer consumed by the same intensity. Observing her thoughts also made her realize how harsh many of them were. How often she spoke to herself with criticism, impatience, and blame. She had internalized a voice that expected her to endure rather than heal. Seeing that voice clearly for the first time was confronting, but also liberating. For the first time, she understood that her thoughts were not commands. They were habits. And habits, once seen, could be interrupted. She didn't need to fight them or replace them yet. Simply not merging with them was already shifting her internal experience. This realization didn't make everything easier overnight. But it changed the direction she was moving in. Instead of being swept away by her inner world, she was beginning to stand within it, aware, present, and no longer powerless. As that awareness settled into her daily experience, she began to notice something unexpected. The simple act of observing her thoughts was slowly turning into a form of choice. Not a forced decision, not an effort to think positively, but a quiet ability to decide whether she would follow a familiar mental path or stay present with what she was actually feeling. This shift softened her emotional world in ways she hadn't anticipated. When sadness appeared, it no longer immediately pulled her into despair. She allowed it to exist without adding layers of meaning to it. She stopped telling herself that feeling low meant something was wrong with her life as a whole. That distinction created relief, even on difficult days. She noticed that her crying began to change. The tears still came, but they didn't feel endless or overwhelming. They moved through her rather than overtaking her. There was less resistance, less fear around them. She wasn't drowning in emotion anymore, she was releasing it. This new relationship with her inner world gave her a sense of steadiness she had never experienced before. She didn't feel strong in a dramatic way. She felt grounded. The kind of grounded that comes from knowing you can sit with discomfort without losing yourself inside it. She also realized how much energy she had been spending trying to escape her emotions. Now that she wasn't fighting them, that energy became available for something else. For clarity. For reflection. For noticing patterns she had never had the capacity to see before. There were moments when the old heaviness tried to return, but it no longer felt absolute. She could feel it arise and still sense herself beyond it. That separation, between who she was and what she was feeling, changed everything. For the first time in a long while, she felt something close to stability. Not because her circumstances had changed, but because her internal landscape was no longer collapsing under its own weight. And within that stability, a new question quietly emerged. If she could choose how she related to her thoughts and emotions, what else in her reality might be responding to that shift? As she remained in that steadier internal state, she began to notice subtle changes in how her days unfolded. Nothing dramatic announced itself. Life didn't suddenly become easy or perfect. But the way situations met her felt different. Less resistant. Less heavy. As if something had shifted in the space between her and the world. She noticed how conversations flowed more naturally when she wasn't already bracing for disappointment. How people responded differently when she showed up without the invisible armor she had been wearing for so long. It wasn't that others had changed, it was that she was no longer meeting them from a place of tension and expectation. Even ordinary moments felt altered. Tasks that once felt overwhelming no longer carried the same emotional weight. Decisions felt clearer because they weren't being filtered through fear. She trusted herself to handle what came next instead of assuming she would be crushed by it. This awareness made her curious again. Not in a naive way, but in a grounded one. She began to wonder whether her internal state had always been shaping her experience more than she realized. Whether the tears, the exhaustion, and the sense of being stuck had been amplified by how she was relating to life from the inside. She didn't rush to define this realization. She didn't label it or turn it into a belief yet. She simply observed the pattern forming. The more present and open she felt internally, the more responsive her external world seemed to be. This didn't mean she stopped encountering difficulty. It meant difficulty no longer felt personal. It no longer confirmed her fears or reinforced her old narrative. It became something she could move through instead of something that defined her. For the first time, she sensed that her emotional state wasn't just reacting to life, it was participating in it. And that participation carried a quiet power she had never known how to access before. She didn't have a framework for this yet. She didn't know what to call it. But she felt its effects clearly enough to know that something fundamental was changing in how she experienced reality itself. As this new internal steadiness became more familiar, she began to sense the importance of sustaining it. Not forcing it, not clinging to it, but creating space so it wouldn't dissolve the moment life presented another challenge. She understood that this shift hadn't come from effort, but from awareness, and awareness needed attention to remain alive. She noticed how easily the mind tried to return to old habits during moments of uncertainty. A delayed response, an unexpected problem, a quiet day that once would have triggered tears. Now, instead of collapsing into those patterns, she paused. And in that pause, she felt a desire to anchor herself in something tangible, something that could help her remember this new way of being when emotions intensified again. Without overthinking it, she turned toward writing. Not as a solution, not as a technique, but as a way to slow her thoughts down and make them visible. Putting words on paper created distance. It allowed her to see what was moving inside her instead of being carried by it. Writing didn't silence her emotions, it organized them. At first, she wrote simply to release what she was feeling. The sadness, the fear, the confusion. But as the pages filled, something shifted. She began to notice moments of relief. Small observations. Tiny changes in how she responded to life. Writing became a mirror, reflecting not only her pain, but her progress. She realized that when she acknowledged what was working, even quietly, her body relaxed. Gratitude appeared naturally, not as an obligation, but as recognition. She wasn't denying her struggles. She was balancing them with awareness of what was supporting her in that moment. Over time, this practice took on a new meaning. It became her journal manifestation, a space where she aligned her thoughts, emotions, and intentions without pressure. She didn't write to demand a new reality. She wrote to stay connected to the state that was already changing how she experienced the one she was in. And as she returned to those pages day after day, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement. Not certainty. But continuity. A sense that this shift wasn't fleeting, it was becoming part of her life. As she stayed consistent with this practice, she began to notice how quietly her days started to reorganize themselves. The emotional intensity that once defined her mornings no longer greeted her the moment she woke up. There was still sensitivity, still depth, but not the same overwhelming weight that had driven her to tears again and again. She realized that writing wasn't changing her life directly. What it was changing was the state from which she experienced it. By returning to her journal manifestation each day, she was training herself to meet reality with awareness instead of anticipation. That shift alone altered how situations unfolded. Small things began to feel different. Conversations that once drained her felt lighter. Decisions that used to trigger anxiety now felt manageable. Even when something didn't go as planned, she didn't spiral into the same emotional collapse. The pause she had learned to create was now automatic, and that pause changed everything. She noticed how her body responded to this new consistency. Her breathing deepened. Her shoulders relaxed. The tears didn't disappear overnight, but they lost their urgency. Crying was no longer the only outlet her system had, it was simply one expression among many. What surprised her most was how sustainable this felt. There was no emotional high to maintain, no pressure to stay positive, no fear of losing progress. She wasn't trying to control outcomes anymore. She was staying aligned with the internal state that allowed her to respond differently to whatever appeared. Over time, this internal steadiness began to reflect outwardly. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became responsive. Opportunities felt less blocked. Solutions appeared without forcing. The sense of being trapped slowly gave way to a feeling of movement. She didn't label this as manifestation yet. She simply recognized that when her inner world shifted, her external experience followed. Not dramatically, but consistently. And consistency, she was learning, was far more powerful than intensity. As this internal shift stabilized, people around her began to notice the difference before she fully named it herself. Not because she talked about it, but because she showed up differently. Her presence felt calmer. Her reactions felt grounded. She listened more and explained herself less. That subtle change altered the energy of every interaction. She noticed how conversations no longer revolved around exhaustion or frustration. When challenges came up, she spoke about them without collapsing emotionally. There was a steadiness in her tone that hadn't been there before. Others responded to that steadiness with trust, openness, and a different kind of respect. What surprised her most was how natural this felt. She wasn't performing a new version of herself. She wasn't trying to appear stronger or more positive. She was simply no longer carrying the same internal weight. The absence of constant emotional overload created space for authenticity. She began receiving feedback she wasn't used to. Comments about how grounded she seemed. How clear her thinking sounded. How she handled situations with more ease. These observations didn't inflate her ego, they confirmed something she already felt internally. Even in moments of stress, she didn't disappear into herself the way she used to. She stayed present. She asked questions instead of assuming outcomes. That presence allowed situations to resolve instead of escalate. Life responded to her differently because she was meeting it from a different place. She reflected on how long she had believed that her tears defined her reality. Now she could see that they had been signals, not identities. Letting go of that identity didn't erase her sensitivity, it allowed it to exist without overwhelming her. And as this new way of being became more visible to others, it became even more real to her. She wasn't imagining the shift. It was being mirrored back to her, quietly confirming that her internal change was shaping a new external experience. Looking back, she could see that nothing about this shift had been accidental. It hadn't happened because she forced herself to feel better or pretended the pain wasn't there. It happened because she committed to a daily practice that gently realigned her thoughts, emotions, and expectations, one moment at a time. The consistency mattered more than the intensity. Returning to her writing each day, even when she didn't feel inspired, created a rhythm that her nervous system could trust. It wasn't about manifesting something specific. It was about staying aligned with the version of herself that no longer lived in constant emotional collapse. She noticed how the act of writing had become a grounding point. On difficult days, it reminded her that she didn't need to be consumed by her emotions to honor them. On calmer days, it helped her recognize how far she had come. The pages held evidence, not of perfection, but of progress. This wasn't magic. It wasn't denial. It was a process. A simple, repeatable way of meeting herself with awareness instead of judgment. Over time, that awareness rewired how she responded to life. And life, in turn, began to respond differently to her. She understood then that manifestation wasn't about asking the universe for a new reality while staying emotionally stuck in the old one. It was about practicing alignment until the old reality no longer matched who she had become. What she had created through her writing wasn't just relief, it was stability. A foundation she could return to no matter what happened externally. And that foundation made everything else possible. She didn't talk about this practice as a secret or a miracle. She saw it for what it was, a daily commitment to herself. One that had quietly changed everything. As this new way of living settled in, she began to recognize how irreversible the shift truly was. Even when difficult emotions appeared, they no longer pulled her back into the same collapse. She felt them, acknowledged them, and let them move through her without defining who she was or what her life meant. The tears no longer frightened her. They no longer felt like proof of failure. They were simply part of her emotional range. Her days carried a different rhythm now. There was space between moments. Space to breathe, to respond, to choose. She no longer lived on the edge of emotional overload, waiting for the next breakdown. That constant pressure had lifted, and in its place was a steady sense of inner safety she had never known before. She noticed how her sense of identity had shifted along with her emotional state. She no longer saw herself as someone who was always overwhelmed, always struggling, always barely holding on. That story had lost its grip. In its place was a quieter, truer understanding of herself, someone capable of moving through life without being consumed by it. This stability began to reflect outwardly in tangible ways. She handled responsibilities with more clarity. She made decisions without panic. She trusted herself to navigate uncertainty instead of fearing it. Life still presented challenges, but they no longer felt like threats to her emotional survival. What moved her most was the realization that she hadn't escaped her sensitivity, she had integrated it. The depth that once caused so much pain had become a source of awareness and strength. She felt deeply, but she no longer drowned in those feelings. Looking back, she could see how every tear had led her here. Not as punishment, but as guidance. The crying hadn't been a sign that something was wrong with her. It had been a sign that something was ready to change. And now, standing in this new reality, she knew with certainty that she would never return to the version of herself who believed endless emotional pain was normal. With clarity replacing chaos, she finally understood what had truly changed. Her reality hadn't shifted because life suddenly became easier or kinder. It shifted because she was no longer meeting life from a place of emotional exhaustion and fear. The way she related to herself had transformed, and everything else followed that alignment. She realized that the tears she once tried to stop had been messages asking for attention, not resistance. Listening to them had allowed her to rebuild herself from the inside out. Instead of pushing through pain, she learned to meet it with awareness, patience, and consistency. That choice changed the trajectory of her life. The new reality she was living in didn't feel fragile. It felt grounded. Even when uncertainty appeared, it no longer shook her sense of safety. She trusted her inner foundation, the one she had built slowly, intentionally, through daily awareness and writing. That trust became her anchor. She no longer searched for proof that things would be okay. She felt it. The emotional stability she had created allowed her to move forward without fear of falling apart again. What once felt impossible now felt natural, even inevitable. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was the end of a chapter defined by suffering without understanding. What came next would be built from clarity, not survival. From alignment, not desperation. She didn't manifest a new reality by wishing for it. She became someone who could live in it. And once that shift happened, everything else rearranged itself to match. And if this story resonated with you, it's not by chance. Awareness always arrives when you're ready to receive it.